Our next speaker is Chloe Gouache. Chloe is a lawyer in both France and the US, and before coming to this program, she practiced in international anti-corruption for 4 years. She came here with the goal of applying her legal skills to ocean conservation, and after the program, she's hoping to continue working in the field of international fisheries and IUU fishing. It is always nice to have a lawyer in the class, in the audience, when teaching ocean law and policy and teaching the courses in this program. But Chloe had such a unique kind of experience as an attorney, and her knack for daylighting corruption is a really unique skill that she was able to bring to the MBC program. I want to say, do not be fooled by Chloe's affable, pleasant, agreeable demeanor. Do not underestimate this human. Chloe is a fierce and skilled attorney who is not afraid to take on complex cases like IUU fishing. So the name of her project, the name of her presentation today is Risk Analysis to Fight Illegal, Unreported, and Unregulated Fishing.
Good afternoon, and thank you, Samantha, for the kind introduction. As Samantha mentioned, I'm going to be talking to you today about risk analysis to fight illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. But first, I'm going to share with you some of my recent meals. I love fish, and this looks delicious, right? But potentially 20% of the fish we eat comes from illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. And that represents billions of dollars in revenue. Do you know whether the fish you eat comes from IUU fishing? It is very difficult to know in practice. So I mentioned IUU fishing. It means illegal, unreported, unregulated fishing. That's how I will talk about it in my presentation. IUU fishing is a big issue because it has grave consequences. It compromises the efforts we make to protect our oceans. It threatens marine species and contributes to the depletion of fish stocks. Studies have shown that IUU fishing vessels sometimes use forced labor and slavery at sea, where people are stranded on boats, sometimes for months, under horrific conditions. It is also linked to a whole range of other criminal behavior, including trafficking of all sorts. And it impacts the food security for communities who rely on fisheries resources for protein and the livelihoods of those that are involved in the sector. So how do fish reach market? Fish has to reach port at some point. When people catch fish in commercial fisheries, fish can reach market in several ways. Catch can come from a fishing vessel directly into port. It can come from a carrier vessel on which fishing vessel transshipped at sea, or it can come from a carrier vessel on which fishing vessel transshipped in port. The point is, all commercially sold fish must come through port at some point. And there is therefore one clear point of focus where we could ideally control all fish before it reaches market. And that is the idea behind the UN FAO agreement on port set measures. The first international binding agreement specifically aimed at tackling IUU fishing through port controls that are also called port set measures. So I mentioned different kind of boats. In commercial fisheries, you have different types of vessels. You have fishing vessel that catch the fish, and you have carrier vessel that transport the fish. And these two interact with each other through operations that are called transshipments, during which the fish, the catch, is moved from one vessel, the fishing vessel, to the carrier vessel. This can happen at sea, or it can happen in port. And one thing that is important to know is that a carrier vessel can hold the catch from 4 to 5 different fishing vessels. I mentioned the Port Set Measures Agreements. I will also refer to it as the PSMA in this presentation. The PSMA includes a number of measures, and for this project, I decided to focus on the pre-arrival to port and port inspection portion of the agreement. So that's everything before catch can actually be landed and therefore reach market. Because that is where what is a true risk analysis should be performed. What the PSMA provides is that when a fishing vessel seeks port entry, the port set must require a minimum level of information and must do so sufficiently in advance to verify that information. Now, the Port Set Measures Agreement also mandates for inspection priorities. when the vessel has been denied port entry before upon the request of another state or international organization, or where there is sufficient ground that the vessel has been engaged in IUU fishing. Now, the idea behind this entire process is that a vessel should be authorized port use or port entry when there is sufficient proof that the vessel has been engaged in IUU fishing. In practice, though, it is a bit more complicated. The PSMA, like an internationally binding agreement, is the role of the PSMA, is to provide a minimum standard, but the lack of details in the agreement leaves room for different level of interpretation. And the only way for an international agreement to actually have an impact is through consistent implementation. So let's take an example to make it a bit more clear. What you can see here is a hypothetical map of different fishing areas. You have the high seas, and inside each dotted line are states' national waters. So a fishing vessel requesting access to Port B for landing would declare that it left Port A, proceeded to fishing in the high seas, fished in State D's national water before requesting port entry in Port B. Under the PSMA, Port B's authorities would ask information that shows that vessel fishing activity and would verify whether that vessel has been flagged as being engaged in IUU fishing. Eventually would require licenses to verify that as well. And the information being consistent could grant port entry without further verification or inspection because it doesn't fall within the priority set in the agreement. For my project, I decided to investigate the processes in place in two countries, Thailand and the Marshall Islands, and use their lessons learned and their port set measures. So why Thailand and Marshall Islands? Well, Thailand because it is the world's third largest seafood exporter, and it processes 20% of the world's tuna, so a lot of fish that we eat comes through there. Also because Thailand was given a yellow card by the European Union in 2015. Yellow cards are given by the European Union to countries as a warning that they need to take effective actions against IUU fishing. This acted as a catalyst for change for Thailand, and they adopted new laws, ramped up their processes, collaborated with organizations such as Ocean Mind, a member of the Seafood Task Force that has been provided Thailand with technology access and training since 2017. And as a result of Thailand's effort, that yellow card was lifted in 2019. And the Marshall Islands, because Majuro, their port, is the second busiest port in the world for foreign vessels visit. So a lot of fish we eat also comes through here, and so it is also key in the fight against IUU fishing. Yet it has very limited resources. It is a small country, but it is part of a regional framework, and so it does pretty good thanks to that. And also because the Marshall Islands is not party to the PSMA yet, but decided to implement post-stat measures before considering whether to become party to the agreement. And also because these two signed a cooperation agreement that goes beyond what is provided for in the agreements, but under which they agree to share a lot of information, including the risk analysis and inspection results that they perform. So I identified some of the best practices from these two countries' experience, and if they have differences, they have a lot in common. Through my analysis, I built guidelines for the risk assessments of foreign vessels requesting port entry, and that includes the advance request of port entry, what information and documentation should be requested and provided, ways to verify that information, and then what follows is a true risk analysis, which is divided between identity and activity risk analysis. So the goal of the identity risks analysis is to verify that the vessel is what it says it is. And the goal of the vessel activity risk is to verify that the vessel's trip is consistent with what it declared it did. Such analysis depends on whether the vessel is a carrier vessel or a fishing vessel. Carrier vessels have particular risk because the catch that they have on board comes from different fishing vessels. And so the risk analysis must not only be performed on the carrier vessel, but also on all donor fishing vessels. For all the vessels coming into port, that risk analysis is performed using satellite tracking data that allows Port Authority to track vessels' movements and identify any undeclared or suspicious activity to verify that the vessel has the right licenses. That analysis allows to identify a certain number of risks, and a summary of these allow port authorities to make informed decisions on whether to authorize or deny port entry, or whether to delay port entry pending the communication of further documentation or information, and to prioritize inspection based on which vessels are at higher risk and therefore should be inspected. What is the added value of these guidelines? Well, if we use the example we already went through, the idea is to track movement of fish to assess that the fish was legal. So the overall risk analysis is to confirm that there wasn't any unreported behavior. So these could include, for example, an undeclared transshipment in port before the fishing making its way to the high seas and meeting with another fishing vessel. And so a port performing a true risk analysis will be able to identify that the vessel had undeclared activity that needs to be accounted for and justified. For a carrier vessel, that risk analysis is performed on the carrier's voyage from where it left port A to potential transshipments at sea to potential transshipments in port before reaching port B for landing. And so just like for the fishing vessel, the analysis must verify whether there was any unreported behavior, such as an undeclared transshipment at sea or an undeclared transshipment in port. But the risk analysis does not stop there. As I mentioned before, it also should be on all the other donor fishing vessels that are not available for inspection. So for example, that fishing vessel in the high seas, Port B's authority would ask information about that fishing vessel and whether it had any potential undeclared activity, like a little detour in the high seas or like somewhere where that fishing vessel did not have authorization to fish. So really from this, which is already pretty complicated, what it can sometimes look like is this. You get it. It is slightly more complicated. It takes time and resources. And what you can see here is that if Port C were to communicate inspection results and risk analysis from this port to Port B's job would be way easier. So my work also highlights the essential role of cooperation and information sharing for the implementation of the PSMA. That's it. That's my project. IUU fishing is a global problem, and I worked on this project to bring my small contribution to the fight against it. I decided to focus my research on building lessons learned and guidelines because I engaged with a number of people from different organizations in different countries that expressed the need for this work. And today there are 69 parties to the agreements, and many more countries are looking into becoming parties, but it is challenging and costly to implement, and a treaty is only as good as it is enforced. So the goal for this work is for it to be a resource for authorities that have become party to the PSMA or countries that are looking into becoming parties to the PSMA. And a resource for port authorities to perform their risk analysis. And I hope to inform the work of organizations in helping countries building capacity to fight against IUU fishing. Thank you for your attention. This work could not have been possible without the support and guidance from my Capstone Advisory Committee, so I would like to thank them all, Mark, Francisco, Don, Sarah, and Natalie. I would also like to thank James Bruce, who did this program in 2019 and was kind enough to share with me his contacts. You should watch his presentation, it's amazing. He also introduced me to Mark, who became my chair, so I feel like I owe him a little bit. And then I would like to thank this program leadership and then the famous and MAS MBC cohort, the truly resilient and adaptable people. And then finally to my family and my partner who listened to this presentation a million times.
Hi, Chloe. If you had to give one recommendation for reducing IUU fishing, what would it be?
Oh, wow. I think this is a very complex question. I think my first impulse would be to just say that we can do something about it in terms of like how we buy our seafood. But I think that would be also a pretty naive answer because the truth is, I think we have very little weight in that industry. So, and I think it shouldn't necessarily be on the consumer to like carry that weight. So I think we can contribute, and I think people should be encouraged to do that effort in everyday life. But I think industries should be the one that carry that weight. And I think there is a push right now for industries to make, for industries that are actually asking for more post-set measures and more control. But I think it's also on them to have more transparency in their supply chain and also to endorse that change and to bear that cost. Because I think one thing that would be very interesting in looking into is just to see if the seafood industry is ready to pay a bit more for seafood, because adopting post-set measures is costly for countries, and so the seafood price should raise because, you know, that it should make sense overall. So I don't think there is a straight answer, but I think, yeah, something big could come from suppliers in the seafood industry. Thank you for the question.
Thanks, Chloe. And we've got a question from the web. Brandon from San Francisco wants to know, is satellite tracking data available to port authorities? And if it is, do they have the resources to analyze it?
Thank you, Brandon, for the question. So satellite tracking data is not always available, and that is one thing that I looked into in my project and in the guidelines. You have two different types of data. You have AAS data and VMS data, and when AAS data is not necessarily available, port authorities need to request tracking data to flag state to be able to track fishing vessels. And from the people I talked with, the feedback that I got is that it is sometimes very challenging to get that information. And so I think that truly highlights the role of cooperation between states and how essential it is to actually share information. So I think that would be the big step in enforcing the agreement.
Great, and one final question. So what incentive is there for a country to ratify the PSMA if in doing so, it only obligates them to incur additional costs and capacity to implement it? Are there any incentives that can be used to gain the interest of more countries to ratify it in the short term?
That is one tough question. Yeah, first impulse would be, well, it is the right thing to do, but this is not a nonprofit, it is an industry, and so I think what is interesting about post-set measures is that they're less costly than monitoring, control, and surveillance mechanism at sea, like vessel patrol. But these are like still necessary. And so I think that overall, there is a push for the seafood industry to have more transparency and know where the fish comes from. So yeah, I think it would be going with that push for the fishing industry. I think at the end, states should just position themselves on the progress side. In addition, the Food and Agriculture Organization is actually putting together a lot of tools to implement the agreements. And we need to keep in mind that this agreement was only entered into force in 2016. So we're still in the capacity building of like tools around this agreement. But there's a lot of resources, and there's also financial assistance provided for in the agreement for developing countries. So I feel like it's the right thing to do.